The Height of Dedication, a tribute to Dorothy Irene Height, 50 years of service. Dr. Dorothy Irene Height's life has been dedicated to human rights. Her commitment to public service, education, and social justice through her work with the YWCA of the USA and the National Council of Negro Women has improved the quality of life for thousands throughout the world. A pioneer whose efforts began in the 1930s, Ms. Height is a leading figure in the movements for civil and human rights. She has provided dynamic leadership to the YWCA and the National Council of Negro Women. In the 1930s, the horizon was not bright. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged the country into the Great Depression. Thousands lost jobs. The bread lines, soup kitchens, and relief rolls came into being. Everything was separate below the Mason-Dixon line and still festering from the terror and lynchings of the early 1900s. In the throes of that bleak period, the National Council of Negro Women was founded.
In 1935, Mary McLeod Bethune, who had been brought to Washington by President Roosevelt as his advisor on minority affairs for the National Youth Administration, discovered, and as she said in later terms, that the Negro woman, the trained and the untrained alike, stood outside of America's mainstream of opportunity, influence, and power. And so she brought together a group of women in the Harlem branch of the YWCA and organized the National Council of Negro Women as an organization of national organizations, because from her vantage point in the federal administration, she came to know that it made a difference to have collective power, which would be expressed through organizations working together. So that she said, we don't need another organization, but we need one that brings together the organizations that there are among us to tackle our problems.
The great visionary Mary McLeod Bethune was an inspiration for the young Dorothy Height, who as a 14-year-old high school student had won a 4-year college scholarship in an Elks oratorical contest. She spoke on the meaning of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States, which she was to work for from then on.
That was a very valuable experience for me, because in the height of the Depression, though I had the grades and I had scholarships of other kinds, I would not have been able to go to college except for that Elks oratorical contest, where I won 4 years in college. And that to me was a very critical point in my life, because as I look back now, I'm still working to see that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution, but also that all of the guarantees of the Constitution are made a reality for all people.
The fights were on many fronts in the 1930s. The great court battles were fought by the NAACP, and it was a time when other major organizations like the National Urban League, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the YWCA, and NCNW all worked together to break racial barriers. In 1937, Miss Height, as vice chair of the United Christian Youth Movement of North America, was a delegate to the World Youth Conference on Life and Work at Oxford, England.
When I returned to the country, I had an invitation from Cecilia Cavanagh Saunders asking me to come in and talk with her. And it was about a position as assistant to her as the executive. And I did that. And it was a conflict for a moment, because I had already accepted to work with the Federation of Churches of Greater New York. But the wonderful thing was that the executive of the YWCA of the City of New York was also the chair of personnel for the Federation of Churches. And we had a kind of get-together, and I was given a choice. And I chose the YWCA.
In 1939, Miss Height was a YWCA representative to the World Conference of Christian Youth in Amsterdam, Holland.
One Saturday afternoon, I was assigned to escort Eleanor Roosevelt into a meeting that Mrs. Bethune was having. Turned out to be the meeting of the National Council of Negro Women. And it was at a time when the First Lady of the land could drive her own car into Harlem, park it in 137th Street, and go into the YWCA to a meeting, and then get back in her car and drive to Hyde Park. I escorted Mrs. Roosevelt into that meeting, and as I was leaving, Mrs. Bethune stopped me and she said, "And what is your name?" I told her. She said, "Come back, we need you." And I've been back ever since. And it was very significant to me that outside of my own mother and my own family, that here were two women who had a great influence on the rest of my life.
World War II in the 1940s brought another giant shift in American life. Racial tensions were heightened by growing black dissatisfaction with fighting overseas for freedom denied at home. Many organizations spoke out against the injustices and accelerated their activities. In 1942, the YWCA reached out to the Japanese American families evacuated to relocation centers, thus taking a bold and unprecedented stand.
It was a time of great suffering in many ways, because here were people who were innocently in a situation just because of their ancestry. And I think that the YWCA was a major force in seeing to it that they not only had services in the centers and programs that had some significance, efforts were made to fill some of the gaps, but it also carried a major advocacy role in trying to see to it that there was some reparation, some justice was done, and some recognition of what this meant in the lives of people.
The NCNW was exposing racial injustice within defense factories and campaigning for the integration of black women into the military. In 1944, Dorothy Height became a member of the staff of the National YWCA as Director for Interracial Education. In 1949, Ms. Height assumed responsibility for volunteer and staff development and soon became Director of Training for the YWCA of the USA. The 1950s brought even more change in the ever-present struggle for equality in this nation. The NAACP's legal work of the 40s made a difference. Important Supreme Court decisions dealt blows to patterns of racial segregation. The Supreme Court, in the historic 1954 decision Brown versus the Board of Education, abolished segregation in the public schools.
The YWCA, through training groups, through discussion groups, through a wide range of sessions, was not only ready, but was eager to help members across the country understand the importance of that policy, of that new position, that new foundation in law from which we could proceed more vigorously to work to bring about equality, and justice.
These gains met with resistance. President Eisenhower had to call on federal troops to protect the safety of school children in Little Rock, Arkansas. The YWCA took an active hand in helping its members and communities support the decision. In the 1950s, Dorothy Height's experience in fighting discrimination and working with diversity in the United States was drawn upon internationally. She was a visiting professor in group work at the University of Delhi School of Social Work, a graduate school founded by the YWCAs of India, Burma, and Ceylon. She served as a goodwill ambassador to South America at the Town Meeting of the World. In 1952, she was appointed by General Marshall to the Defense Advisory Council on Women in the Armed Services. In 1957, Dorothy Height, who had served as national president of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, became the president and chief executive officer of the National Council of Negro Women. Determined to carry on the tradition of Mrs. Bethune, Dorothy Height began the work that was to make the NCNW a major force in the civil rights movement of the 60s. Rosa Parks' refusal to sit in the back of the bus led to the Montgomery boycott that sparked the great civil rights movement of the 60s. 4 A&T college students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and with this sit-in, stepped up the drive toward freedom. Freedom rides, urban protests, demonstrations, picket lines, the massive march on Washington culminating with Dr. Martin Luther King's memorable I Have a Dream speech. Dr. Dorothy Height was a part of the drive.
At the time of the March on Washington, there was a righteous indignation that had swept this country. There were people in all racial and economic groups who felt that the country had to rid itself of the last residue of the segregation system. But it was not long-lasting, because many of those who had gone to jail singing "We Shall Overcome" and who worked hard to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 suddenly discovered that they had won the right to go into hotels and motels and all places of public accommodation, but they did not have the economic position from which to pay the check.
The nation was shaken with the assassination of President Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, the bombing of 4 little girls in a church in Alabama, and the murder of Medgar Evers. In the face of the turbulence of the 60s when cities were burning, the president appointed the National Kerner Commission on Disorders in the Streets, which revealed clearly that the disorders stemmed from racism.
We took not only the Kerner Commission's report, but other materials and used them to help us gain an understanding about what it meant to have a society in which racism was so deeply embedded, disrupt in so many ways. What significance did this have for an organization with our kind of purpose and with our diversity of population? How could the YWCA be a constructive force for change? How could we help bring about the kinds of relationships that would overcome some of the polarization that had occurred?
Dorothy Height accepted membership on a 29-member council to the White House Conference on Civil Rights, the Board of Governors of the American Red Cross, President Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women, and became a consultant to the Secretary of State for African Affairs. Many recognized her work. She received a Doctor of Humane Letters from Tuskegee Institute, the first of 15 honorary degrees. The Elks of the world gave her their highest honor, the Lovejoy Award for decades of public service. With this award and her 4-year Elks scholarship 30 years before, Dorothy Height had come full circle. In the 70s, we built on the gains of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Equal Pay Act laid a new and stronger foundation in law. The 1970 YWCA of the USA Convention was held in Houston, Texas, the first convention held in the South since the 1930s.
Coming to that convention, the National Board had presented 7 imperatives which it felt had to be considered as priorities for the YWCA in the period ahead. But as that group of black women met and began to assess themselves and what they had to bring to the whole movement, to see themselves in their many different relationships, they came through with the feeling that racism and its elimination, which was one of the imperatives, was really not on the same terms as the elimination of poverty, as working for a world of peace and the like, because they saw racial factors in all of those other imperatives. And so they said, what we need to recommend is that there be one imperative. And they brought that recommendation, not as a caucus, not as a protest group, but as people carrying responsible membership, attracted by the same purpose that had attracted everyone else, given the same commitments that all other members had. And they brought it to the convention. It was adopted. And it came forward as one imperative. They said that our one imperative shall be to thrust our collective power toward the elimination of racism wherever it exists and by any means necessary.
In 1974, NCNW erected the Mary McLeod Bethune Monument, the first memorial to a black American or to a woman of any race to be erected in a public park in the nation's capital.
Mary McLeod Bethune was a magnificent human being. She was born in 1875 of slave parents. She's the only black woman ever to have founded a 4-year accredited college. And in 1935, she founded the National Council of Negro Women. We discovered in Lincoln Park, in our nation's capital, a monument which was placed there in 1874 by the newly emancipated citizens of the United States, our ancestors. These people, at the call of Charlotte Scott, who gave the first $5 she'd earned in her freedom to start this monument when she heard that Mr. Lincoln had been assassinated, petitioned the Congress and were given the piece of land that is called Lincoln Park on which to place this statue. The statue in the park has Abraham Lincoln with a slave at his knee. The chain has been broken. And it says, placed by the emancipated citizens, and it is called the Emancipation Group. We asked the National Congress, the 92nd Congress, to give us the permission to place in that park a monument that would represent not only the reality of slavery and emancipation, but the contribution that black people have made in every phase of American life. And the fitting symbol for that was Mary McLeod Bethune.
In 1977, Miss Height, then director of the Center for Racial Justice, retired from the YWCA. Today, the YWCA and the NCNW are concerned with programs that address current needs: teenage pregnancies, drug abuse, health services, and daycare. The highlight of 1986 for the NCNW was the first National Black Family Reunion.
From its inception, the National Council of Negro Women has been task-oriented. It has called women from different backgrounds to get over their tendency to be competitive and learn what it means to be collaborative as we approach the problems that affect Black women and their families. And it has been a channel not only for opening doors, but preparing women to enter through those doors. It has worked to deal with hunger and malnutrition and housing and education and health. And today, in a climate in which so much is said negative about Black people and Black families, and it is not only Black people and Black families, but all people of color, all people in whose groups poverty is disproportionately high, that the National Council of Negro Women has made a strong effort to build upon the strengths, to reaffirm the traditional values, to recognize the coping skills, and to enhance what we have learned through our achievements about the Black family. And so we've called for a Black family reunion celebration to celebrate those values.
During the 1980s, as the YWCA celebrates its 125th anniversary, the 40th anniversary of its interracial charter, and enters into the second decade of its imperative, the elimination of racism, new incentives will be taken in their continued steps along the way to gain peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all.
In honoring Dorothy Height, we honor the great possibilities for goodness that are at the heart of America. And in the end, when this party is over and the music and the speeches are all finished, there is no more lasting tribute we can offer her than the desire and the determination to carry on her work. Dorothy Height has proved the difference that one person's faith and courage can make. What a magnificent example she has given us. What a beautiful reason for us to celebrate. Thank you very much.
When the roll is called, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Mary McLeod Bethune, Dorothy Height has earned her place around that welcome table. She has scaled mountains few would dare to challenge. As Marion so eloquently said, and let it not fall lightly upon our ears, Dorothy is the living link, the continuity between Mrs. Bethune and Adam Powell Sr. and Jr., and Paul Robeson and Du Bois and Malcolm and Philip Randolph, and Roy Wilkins and Walter White, Whitney Young and Dr. King. Just no one has served longer and closer with the giants of this century than has this precious woman.
I'm very proud that I lived long enough to see some of the good things that have happened for our people. I haven't seen enough. I may not live to see a lot more, but I have lived to have Dorothy in my career and my life. And I want all of you to raise your glasses and join me in a toast to our great lady, my great inspiration, our great American, our great Black lady, Dorothy Height.
This is not a personal tribute. that in a sense I am symbolic of the many, many people who work hard, who have dedicated themselves, and who are determined that this country will live up to all of its great ideals, and that an organization, an institution that has a great heritage will fulfill its mission in ways that make a difference, not only at home, but throughout the world. And I'm so glad I chose the YWCA. I am.